I once watched a woman in a $1,000 dress scream for help while sinking into a mud pit, holding a bouquet over her head like it was the last lifeline she had left on Earth. But none of that compared to the moment her guests blocked my ranch driveway, cutting off a critical livestock delivery, because their GPS told them my land was a scenic shortcut. That's when I knew the universe had handed me a golden opportunity for payback. And lucky for me, I had 3 ranch dogs who were just as petty as I am. The morning started like any other, calm, productive, and smelling faintly of hay and strong coffee. I was halfway through realigning the cattle gates for the new bull arriving at noon. My ranch isn't a fancy operation, but it's my pride and livelihood. 400 acres of rolling pasture, a working barn, a few stubborn goats, and a trio of dogs trained better than most kids I've met. The peace shattered around 9:07 a.m., when a parade of shiny black SUVs and pastel sedans rolled up like they were auditioning for a car commercial. I blinked. Was there a funeral no one told me about? They weren't slowing down either. One after another, they rolled past the clearly posted private property signs and parked along my gravel driveway, some even nudging into the edges of my pasture fencing. I dropped the wrench in my hand and made my way down the hill. My boots hit the dirt just as a woman with oversized sunglasses and a walkie-talkie stepped out of a white Escalade and started yelling about flower placement. She didn't even notice me at first, until I spoke up. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "you're on private property." She turned with a fake smile that could have curdled milk. "Oh, hi there. Don't worry, we're just parking for a quick wedding ceremony up the road. My name's Karen, I'm the event coordinator." She waved her walkie-talkie like it was a badge. "And that gives you the right to park 27 vehicles on someone else's ranch?" I asked. Her smile cracked a little, but she didn't break stride. "Your place looked empty. We figured you wouldn't mind for just a couple hours. You have such a lovely view." The bride wanted to do her entrance with the mountains behind her. So romantic, right? I looked behind her. 2 groomsmen in tuxedos were trying to wrangle a folding table out of the trunk, on my gravel. A woman in high heels was tiptoeing around cow patties like she'd wandered into a minefield. One of the kids had already wandered too close to my horse pen. I could see my bull delivery getting delayed, livestock getting stressed, and liabilities stacking up like hay bales in July. "You need to move the cars." "Now," I said, stepping forward. "This isn't a venue. This is a working ranch." Karen huffed like I'd just asked her to donate a kidney. "Look, you don't understand how important today is. The bride's father is a judge, okay? We don't want any trouble. It's just for a couple of hours. Can't you be a good neighbor?" "Funny," I said, "because good neighbors don't trespass." She turned away before I could say more, barking into her walkie-talkie, "Tell the florist to set up by the fence, not the barn. And make sure no one steps in the poop, okay?" That's when I knew reasoning was off the table. I walked back to the barn and whistled. 3 heads perked up: Bear, Moxie, and Diesel. They're working dogs, part shepherd, part brilliant chaos. They know the land, know the signals, and more importantly, they know when I'm annoyed. Bear's a tank, broad-shouldered and low to the ground. Moxie's the speed demon with the attitude to match. Diesel? He's the brains, the type of dog who will open the feed bin just to watch the chickens lose their mind. I gave them one hand signal, then pointed toward the cars. It started small. Just a tail wag here, a curious sniff there. Diesel weaved between the sedans, setting off car alarms with his tail. Moxie jumped up on one of the open trunks, scattering a box of programs into the wind. Bear calmly walked right up to a guest, trying to light a unity candle, and knocked the lighter out of his hand with a casual nudge. Karen shrieked, "Get these dogs away! Someone control them!" "I'd love to," I said. "But technically, they're on their property." The guests started panicking. One woman ran in stilettos and twisted her ankle near the goat pen. A man in a tux took off sprinting after Bear, who had snagged a piece of floral ribbon and was prancing like he'd just won Best in Show. Moxie zigzagged through the crowd, her muddy paws leaving prints on chiffon dresses and linen pants. Diesel sat down next to the cake table, waiting, just waiting, for someone to shoo him. No one dared. And amid the confusion, I walked over to my truck and backed it right across the only entrance. At a livestock trailer and a tractor? Congratulations! Now the entire wedding party was locked in. Karen came stomping back toward me, covered in sweat, mascara running. You're going to pay for this. I'm calling the HOA and the police. Good luck, I said. This land isn't in your HOA. And the sheriff? He's on my speed dial. I donate ribeyes to the station every Christmas. She opened her mouth, probably to spew something involving lawsuits or Yelp reviews, but she was interrupted by the distant honk of the livestock truck that couldn't get through. My cattle were scheduled to arrive in less than 20 minutes, and the blocked entrance meant they'd have to wait on the county road, blocking traffic and racking up fees by the minute. The stakes were no longer just pride or property. Now it was business, time-sensitive and non-negotiable. Karen seemed to realize things had shifted. But it was too late. Behind her, the dogs had regrouped near the fence line, tails wagging as they herded the remaining guests toward the only open field path left, straight down a slope freshly soaked from last night's storm. And I leaned on the fence, sipped my coffee, and smiled. The mud pit wasn't my idea of a wedding gift, but hey, nature works in mysterious ways. The beauty of ranch dogs isn't just their loyalty or intelligence, it's their uncanny ability to detect entitlement from a mile away. As Karen's guests stumbled around in overpriced shoes and confused entitlement, Bear, Moxie, and Diesel were already shifting gears from mildly curious to chaotic good. And let me be very clear. They didn't need commands. These dogs had been watching me deal with HOA nonsense for years. They knew the signs. Fancy clothes. Loud voices. People ignoring the gate. It was game time. Moxie was the first to make her move. With the grace of a fox and the speed of a lightning bolt, she darted between a bridesmaid and a man carrying folding chairs, brushing mud onto their pants with perfect precision. The man yelped, stumbled, and the chairs clattered to the ground. One of them hit Karen's precious floral arch, knocking it slightly off balance. She screamed something unintelligible into her walkie-talkie. I could hear the static, but not the sense. Diesel followed next, circling a small cluster of guests who were trying to reorganize a toppled table. His expression was entirely innocent, like he just wanted to help. But then he let out a single, well-timed bark, just loud enough to startle a woman who was balancing a glass tray of cupcakes. The cupcakes flew. Pink frosting splattered across the groom's cousin's shirt like an abstract painting. Bear let out a low, approving chuff. He appreciated good art. The guests were now officially on edge. A few of them tried to climb back into their cars, only to realize they were blocked in on all sides. My truck, the livestock trailer, and the tractor I'd parked earlier had sealed off every inch of driveway. A few guests began to mutter nervously, and one of them, an older man in a straw fedora and a Bluetooth earpiece, tried to act tough. "I'll handle this," he said, puffing out his chest as he marched over to me. "You're gonna move that truck and let us leave, or I'll call my lawyer." I didn't even look up from my coffee. "Your lawyer gonna airlift those cars out of my driveway?" He stared at me like I'd just insulted his yacht. "You're interfering with a legal wedding event." "Nope," I replied. "You're interfering with a federal livestock delivery. Those trucks don't stop because some lady wants Pinterest pictures." That's when the dogs kicked things into full gear. Bear took the lead, trotting up to a cluster of guests gathered near the barn gate. He barked twice and wagged his tail like a friendly tour guide. One woman smiled, mistaking the gesture for cuteness. "Ah, he wants to show us something," she cooed. She followed him. And so did 5 others, including the woman in the stilettos, the groomsman who had already lost a shoe, and a kid holding a camera on a selfie stick. Bear turned up the hill, rounded the chicken coop, and began leading them toward the back pasture. Diesel and Moxie flanked them, weaving in and out like escort vehicles. It looked so coordinated, so intentional, that not one of the guests questioned it. I knew exactly where they were headed. And I didn't stop them. See, just beyond the barn and around the edge of my cattle fence is what I call Muck Gulch. It's a low-lying patch of earth that gets particularly nasty after a storm. And we'd had a good one last night, thunder, sheets of rain, and wind strong enough to tip a wheelbarrow. Muck Gulch wasn't just wet. It was swampy. Clay-rich, deceptive mud that could suck a boot right off your foot and keep it as a trophy. Bear led the procession right to it. The guests followed, chatting and laughing nervously, still clinging to the belief that this was some kind of scenic detour. But once the first heel sank, it was over. A shriek split the air. Then another. My shoe! Oh my God, my shoe! The woman in stilettos had lost both. One was visible, stuck in the mud like a sinking ship. The other was gone, devoured completely. Her pastel dress was splattered. She tried to backpedal, only to fall flat on her rear, splashing mud up her back like a geyser. The groomsman tried to help her and promptly slipped himself, landing face first in a puddle of brown slush. His suit was no longer navy, it was camouflage. The kid with the selfie stick tried to record it all, laughing hysterically, until Moxie raced past him, splashing a streak of mud across his phone lens. That laugh turned into a shriek when he dropped the phone straight into the goo. Diesel, ever the tactician, herded the remaining guests in a tight circle near the worst of the mud pit. They couldn't go forward without getting deeper, and turning back would mean squeezing past Moxie, who had suddenly decided to sit, blocking the path with her muddy backside and a look of smug satisfaction. Back near the driveway, Karen had noticed the commotion and came charging over, veil flapping behind her like an angry flag. "What are you doing? This is not the ceremony site." She reached the edge of Muck Gulch and froze. Her platform heels sank half an inch just standing there. Her eyes went wide. "Someone go get them. I can't have my guests looking like this. Like they've visited a real ranch?" I offered. She shot me a death glare. "This is a disaster. I'll be leaving a review, I'll sue you, and you'll never host another wedding again." "Didn't know I started," I said. Just then, the photographer arrived. He was a lanky guy named Tyler, with a long lens and a wicked sense of humor. He was actually a friend of mine. Karen had hired him through a third party and hadn't even realized he was local. He took one look at the scene, grinned, and began snapping photos like he was at a national park. "Oh yeah," he said under his breath. "This one's going viral. Delete those pictures." Karen shouted. "This isn't the vibe we want." Tyler lowered his camera just long enough to reply, "Lady, you're giving me Pulitzer material right now." Bear walked up beside him, tail wagging like crazy. Tyler reached down, gave him a good scratch, and said, "Good boy. You really know how to direct a crowd." Karen stormed off, stomping in a full circle, only to step into a small patch of soggy ground. Her heels sank, then snapped. She pitched sideways, catching herself on the wedding arch, only to have one side collapse with her. Silk flowers rained down. The guests, covered in mud, tried to help, but their slippery hands just made things worse. And through it all, my dogs sat in a perfect triangle formation, watching their masterpiece unfold. They didn't bark. They didn't jump. They just stared like artists admiring a finished canvas. They had led the guests straight into the pit, orchestrated chaos with surgical precision, and never once stepped paw into trouble themselves. I took a long sip from my coffee thermos and nodded. Nature might have delivered the mud, but my dogs served up the justice. The thing about mud is, it doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if your dress cost $5,000 or if your makeup was airbrushed by some influencer's personal stylist. It doesn't care if you're the bride, the best man, or just some tag-along cousin trying to score free booze. Mud is the great equalizer, and on this day, it became the wedding's uninvited guest of honor. By the time half the guests had been led into the pit by my tactical trio of dogs, the rest were growing increasingly frantic. Some tried climbing the pasture fences to get better cell reception, waving their phones like flags. One man stood on the hood of a Lexus, swearing at the sky and threatening to call the National Guard if someone didn't fix this disaster. It might have been funny if it weren't for the fact that my livestock delivery was now 35 minutes late because the truck couldn't access the property. The hauler had called twice, each time more frustrated, asking when I'd move the ridiculous blockade of wedding rejects. I told him to hold tight. Justice was still cooking. Back at the muddy chaos site, Karen had given up trying to save her guests and was now focused on salvaging the one thing she thought still mattered: the wedding photos. Her voice echoed across the fields as she barked at the photographer, Tyler, who had stationed himself just above the pit to catch the carnage from every possible angle. "Get the bridesmaids on the gravel!" she screamed, her once flawless hair now stringy and stuck to her face. "And someone clean the dog footprints off the altar rug. Where's the flower girl?" The flower girl, last I saw, had decided Moxie was far more interesting than flowers. The little girl was now riding in a wheelbarrow, being pulled in circles by one of the teenage ranch hands who'd come to watch the show during his break. Both of them were laughing like it was the best carnival ride in town. Karen stomped up to me again, her arms flailing like some sort of couture windmill. "I want you to do something about your dogs. They've ruined everything. My cousin's ankle is swollen, the groomsman has hives, and someone said your goat ate their handbag." I gave a slow blink. "Sounds like you're having a real authentic ranch experience." Her voice rose several octaves. "I didn't book a ranch experience. I just wanted to use your land for ambience." "Funny," I said, leaning on the fence post. "I didn't offer my land for anything." Before she could respond, another scream rang out from the pit area. This time it was the bride herself, who had apparently decided to take matters into her own hands by attempting a heroic mud rescue. Unfortunately, her billowy dress acted like a sail in the wind and immediately tangled around her legs. She face-planted so hard into the muck that the entire crowd went silent for a solid 5 seconds before an audible gasp rippled through them. Diesel barked once, loud and short. If I didn't know better, I'd say he was laughing. The bride sat up slowly, now unrecognizable under layers of brown sludge. One fake eyelash was stuck to her cheek. A guest tried to help her up, but slipped as well, landing sideways and knocking over a folding chair that had somehow ended up in the pit too. Tyler kept snapping photos, his camera clicking like a typewriter writing a very different kind of love story. "Stop taking pictures," Karen screamed at him. "You're making this worse." "I'm documenting the day," Tyler replied with a shrug. "This is what the day looks like." 2 more guests tried to leave but discovered the driveway was now completely blocked. My truck, the trailer, and now my neighbor's ATV, he'd stopped by to drop off some fencing, were all positioned in such a way that no one could drive in or out. One of the guests attempted to move my trailer without asking. That plan failed when they couldn't figure out how the locking hitch worked and ended up denting their own bumper in the process. At this point, the catering truck finally arrived. Or rather, attempted to. The driver stopped at the bottom of the road, took one look at the disaster ahead, and called me. "I'm not going near that mess," he said. "Not with $5,000 worth of food in the back." "Totally fair," I replied. "You want to turn around?" "Yup. I'll drop it off later if you want it for yourself." "I'll take the brisket," I said, grinning. And with that, the food for the wedding disappeared. The guests, now covered in sweat and mud, were starting to feel the hunger. A groomsman tried handing out granola bars from someone's glove box, and another woman started passing around mints like they were emergency rations. Meanwhile, Karen was pacing and shrieking into her phone. "They won't come in. They won't deliver. What do you mean the band left? Why is the DJ crying in his car?" I took another sip from my coffee and checked the time. The livestock hauler was now an hour late, and while the show unfolding before me was deeply satisfying, I knew at some point I'd need to restore order. Just then, my sheriff buddy, Sam, pulled up in his cruiser. He'd heard from the hauler about the blocked driveway and decided to swing by. When he stepped out and surveyed the scene, he didn't even try to hide his laugh. "Well," he said, adjusting his hat, "looks like your cows aren't the only things getting wrangled today." "I tried to warn them," I said. "Didn't listen." Sam walked up to Karen, who was red-faced and now covered in flecks of mud from shouting near the pit. "Ma'am, you aware you're trespassing on private property?" Her face went pale. Well, we were told it was fine. It's just for a wedding." "By who?" "Me," she snapped, realizing how ridiculous that sounded the second it left her mouth. Sam nodded slowly. "So, not the owner." Karen looked like she wanted to scream but couldn't figure out in what direction to send the rage. Sam handed her a citation slip. "Trespassing. Reckless endangerment. Possible animal disturbance charges if the goat really did eat someone's purse. You can argue it in court." Karen stared at the paper like it had personally insulted her lineage. Sam turned to me. "You want to press charges, or just let Karma do the heavy lifting?" "I think Karma's handling things just fine," I said. Diesel barked again, as if in agreement. Sam tipped his hat. "I'll go talk to the hauler. See if we can get things moving." And with that, the ceremony that never was reached a new low. Guests were hungry, muddy, and mad. The bride had disappeared into the barn to cry. The band had bailed. The cake was melting in the sun. And through it all, my dogs sat proudly, watching the aftermath of their perfect trap unfold like a well-written play. It wasn't the wedding Karen planned, but it was definitely the one she earned. The thing about people like Karen is, they never know when to quit. Even after being handed a citation by the sheriff, after losing the caterer, the band, and half her guests to a sinkhole of mud and misery, she still held on to the belief that she could salvage the day with a little more yelling and a whole lot of denial. The problem was, reality didn't care about her Pinterest board or the judge daddy she kept name-dropping like it was a spell that could undo consequences. And by now, every attempt she made to regain control only sank her deeper. Karen stood in the middle of my ranch, soaked in sweat, mascara smudged, one heel broken, holding her phone above her head like a lifeline. She was trying to reach someone from the HOA, probably assuming they could storm in with a clipboard and fix everything. What she didn't seem to grasp was that my property sat outside of the HOA boundary, in a patch of land they had absolutely no say over. She might as well have been calling Santa Claus. Sure enough, a few minutes later, a silver SUV pulled in behind the sheriff's cruiser. 3 people got out, 2 men and a woman, all dressed like they were headed to a board meeting and none of them ready for the war zone they just stepped into. Karen practically sprinted to them, waving like she'd spotted a rescue helicopter. "Thank God," she said. "They've completely ruined the ceremony. I need you to shut this down and find this guy. I've got pictures. I've got video." He let dogs attack my guests, and then stood by while his livestock destroyed our decor. The woman from the HOA looked around slowly. Her heels sank slightly into the gravel. She took in the mud-covered guests, the broken arch, the crying bride on a folding chair with cake smeared on her elbow, and the sheriff calmly sipping sweet tea from a thermos. "Karen," she said after a long pause, "did you get permission to use this property?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "I didn't need to. It's right next to the community. It's practically part of the neighborhood. And he wasn't using it." The woman blinked slowly. "Karen, this land isn't under HOA jurisdiction. And even if it was, you'd need written approval for an event. You can't just annex someone's ranch because it has nice lighting." Karen spun toward me with a furious glare. "You told them I gave you permission, right?" she hissed at one of the guests, a man holding a ruined bouquet and looking like he regretted every decision he'd made that day. "I thought you had it handled," he mumbled. "You said you'd cleared it." "Oh, she turned back, fire in her eyes. "Fine. I'll fix it myself. Just wait till you see the invoice." She was still yelling when the sheriff approached again, this time holding a printed-out land deed. He handed it to the HOA rep, who scanned it quickly and nodded. This property was never included in the zoning plan. It predates the neighborhood by 15 years. Karen looked like her world had caved in. But someone told me, there was a rumor. Rumors don't hold up in civil court, the sheriff said with a shrug. And neither do trespassing events disguised as weddings. As Karen stood there stammering, trying to string together an argument out of sheer indignation, the bride's mother came storming across the yard. She was an older woman in a sagging cream dress now stained at the hem, her hair plastered to her forehead. She looked furious, but not at me. She walked straight up to Karen and pointed a shaking finger in her face. "You told us this was booked. You told me you handled everything. My daughter is in tears, half our guests are gone, and you have the nerve to act like this is someone else's fault." Karen stumbled backward. "I didn't know it would rain. I didn't know the dogs would be untrained." "They're more trained than you," I muttered. The bride's mom whirled around toward me, but when she saw my calm stance, the sheriff beside me, and the dogs sitting patiently by the barn, her expression softened. "Are you the owner?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She let out a breath. "I'm sorry we ruined your day. This wasn't supposed to happen like this." "No offense taken. I know this wasn't your plan," I said. "She told us she'd booked a rustic barn," the woman went on, glaring at Karen again. "She said it had catering and a view and guest parking. We paid her. She charged us like a real venue." That caught the sheriff's attention. "She charged you?" The bride's mom nodded. $4,000 up front. Non-refundable." Karen took a step back. "That was for planning services. Not the property." The bride's mother pointed a trembling finger again. "You lied." Now there was real heat. Now the sheriff's expression shifted. "Did you advertise this location as a rentable venue?" Karen's mouth opened again, but nothing came out. The HOA reps all took a synchronized step away from her. Sheriff Sam pulled out his phone and started tapping. "Depending on how you advertised and what you charged, that might qualify as operating an unlicensed event business. Especially if you used photos of land that isn't yours." Karen finally snapped. "This is a witch hunt. All I did was try to make a beautiful day happen." He could have helped. He could have said yes. He could have. "I said no," I interrupted. "And you didn't listen." The guests were now gathered in clusters, watching like it was reality TV. Tyler, the photographer, had stopped taking pictures and was just leaning against the fence, shaking his head and muttering, "Better than HBO." One of the groomsmen handed me a $50 bill and said, "Can I at least use a hose or something? I can't sit in my car like this." "Sure," I said, nodding toward the barn. 3-hour minimum. I'll even throw in a towel." He laughed like he couldn't believe I was serious. I wasn't kidding. Another man tried to sneak toward the water spigot on the side of my shed. Diesel, who had been dozing in the grass, lifted his head and let out a low growl. The man froze, turned around, and walked away without saying a word. By now, the wedding was fully collapsed. Vendors had left, some guests were begging for rides, and Karen was off to the side yelling into her phone, probably trying to find a lawyer. One of the HOA reps politely asked if they could leave before things escalated further. The sheriff let them go but handed one of them a card. "Just in case you want to report any unauthorized business activity," he said. "Could be a zoning violation. Could be fraud. Someone should look into it." And then, as if the universe wanted to sign off with one final joke, one of the goats wandered over to where the bride's custom shoes had been dropped during the mud escape. The goat sniffed, chewed, and swallowed the left heel with a look of absolute peace. Nobody even tried to stop it. As the sun began to dip low over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the field, and turning every puddle of chaos into a shimmering reminder of the day's downfall, the wedding that never was finally began to unravel completely. Guests trickled off in muddy pairs, some shoeless, some red-faced, many too embarrassed to make eye contact with anyone. The sound of a crying baby echoed faintly from one of the SUVs, where a young couple was trying to clean frosting off their infant's car seat using napkins soaked in bottled water. You'd think a tornado had ripped through a party, but no, it was just a Karen with a dream and a few too many assumptions. I stood near the fence with my thermos, now filled with iced tea instead of coffee, watching the aftermath unfold like a slow-motion car crash. My dogs, covered in just the right amount of mud to avoid suspicion but not enough to look innocent, lounged at my feet. Diesel let out a snore. Bear had claimed an abandoned centerpiece, and was quietly chewing it with the satisfaction of a job well done. Moxie lay with her head resting on my boot, clearly proud of her afternoon's contribution to rural justice. Karen hadn't left. She'd stopped pacing and screaming, possibly because her voice had finally given up on her, or maybe because the sheer weight of humiliation had finally landed. She sat on the hood of her Escalade, slumped like a rag doll, dress wrinkled, mascara streaks carved into her cheeks, and the faint outline of a muddy paw print across her back that no one had the heart to mention. Her phone had long since died. I'd seen her trying to yell at it earlier like she could scream it back to life. Nearby, the bride was wrapped in a borrowed ranch blanket, rocking back and forth while her mom tried to console her. The groom, who had barely said a word all day, was in the passenger seat of a pickup truck with the AC blasting, sipping from a flask he clearly hadn't planned to need. Everyone looked like they'd aged 10 years in 6 hours. The sheriff had returned to his cruiser but hadn't left yet. I figured he was sticking around in case someone threw a punch, or maybe just because he didn't want to miss whatever final piece of insanity the day might cough up. Tyler, the photographer, finally stopped laughing long enough to pack up his gear. He gave me a look that said he knew he had something special in those SD cards. "You gonna post any of that?" I asked. "Only the stuff that doesn't show your address," he said. "But yeah, this one's going viral. You blur the goats though?" "Of course." We shared a quiet chuckle, and then he gave Bear a friendly scratch behind the ears and headed off, whistling like a man who just won the documentary of the year. I turned to see Karen standing now, shakily, brushing herself off with what little dignity she had left. She glanced around, noticed her audience had shrunk, and made her way over to me, slow and unsteady like someone walking back to the principal's office after a failed prank. "I'm leaving," she croaked. "But this isn't over." "Oh, it's definitely over," I replied. "You just haven't realized it yet." Her mouth opened to deliver some kind of retort, but nothing came out. She looked around one last time, at the wreckage, the guests she'd alienated, the shoes still half buried in the pit, the goat that was now nibbling on a torn wedding program, and you could see it hit her like a freight train. This wasn't a bad day. This wasn't an oopsie. This was a reputation-ending, lawsuit-generating, HOA-splitting catastrophe, and her fingerprints were on every bit of it. I gave a little nod toward the driveway. "Road's clear now. You're free to go." She didn't say thank you. Just turned and walked away with the stiff, jerky movements of someone holding in a very public meltdown. A few of the remaining guests followed her, all wearing the same glazed-over expressions you see on people exiting a theme park after getting stuck on a broken ride in the rain. As her car pulled out, my neighbor's ATV came bouncing down the road again. He slowed beside me and leaned over the handlebars, grinning like a man who'd just missed a tornado and heard about it through the grapevine. "So," he said, "I hear your dog started a mud riot." "More like guided chaos," I said. "They knew what they were doing." He laughed. "Well, I brought something for the heroes." He reached into a bag strapped to the back and pulled out 3 massive bones, fresh, meaty, and wrapped like gift. The second the dogs saw them, their ears perked up like satellite dishes. I took the bones, thanked him, and tossed them one by one to my furry squad. They each caught their reward with pride and flopped into the grass to chew in peace. A few hours later, after everyone had cleared out and the sheriff had finally tipped his hat and gone, I walked down to the gate and hung up a new sign. I'd been working on it during the commotion, carving it with an old wood burner I hadn't touched in years. Private property. Trespassers will be escorted by dogs. They know where the mud is. I hung it straight, stepped back, and admired it like you do a good meal before taking the first bite. Then I turned and headed back toward the barn, where the sunset threw shadows across the fields and the goats were settling down for the night. Later that evening, while cleaning up scraps from the field and collecting stray plastic forks and wilted floral arrangements, I got a text from Tyler. Just a link and a single sentence. "You're not gonna believe the comments." The video was already trending. Karen's wedding gone wrong. The dogs. The mud pit. The slow-mo shot of the bride flailing in her gown. The screams. The goats. The soundtrack someone had added was almost too perfect, something between dramatic opera and hillbilly banjo. The top comment read, "This isn't a wedding. This is a spiritual reckoning." Another said, "Justice isn't always served in court. Sometimes it's delivered by a dog named Bear and a mud pit the size of Florida." I closed my phone and smiled. I hadn't set out to ruin anyone's wedding. All I'd wanted was a clear driveway and some peace on my own land. But when someone invites chaos onto your property, sometimes the only thing you can do is sit back and let the dogs handle it. And judging by the final tally, mud-caked shoes, ruined gowns, trespassing fines, a community scandal, and 3 very full-bellied dogs, I'd say they handled it just fine.